Here we have an assessment standard question which covers lymphocytes, so both B and T lymphocytes could be questioned here. It's a level A. Failure of the immune system can lead to conditions such as allergy and autoimmune disease. You have to choose one of these conditions. However, since it's a starter, you could actually choose both and complete the table, or just write in your notes with information about each. For B lymphocytes, our example would be allergy, and B lymphocytes attack or respond to a harmless antigen. The condition of an autoimmune disease, or you could have named one of them, is a T lymphocyte, and it attacks or responds to self-antigens. From page 31 of our student guide, we're looking at the last remaining two learning intentions here. By the end of this PowerPoint, you need to be able to describe the action of B and T lymphocytes acting as memory cells, and to describe the action of HIV and how it leads to the development of AIDS. A recap, this full chapter we've been looking at lymphocytes and the fact that they are white blood cells involved in the specific immune response. We have distinguished between B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. B lymphocytes are responsible for producing antibodies, whilst T lymphocytes are responsible for what we call the cell-mediated response, where they attack infected cells and induce cell death. Here we have a recap of B lymphocytes and a mature B cell responding to an antigen and presenting and producing the appropriate antibodies. When a person is infected by a disease-causing organism, the body responds by producing antibodies. This is called the primary response. Due to a latent period elapsing before the appearance of the antibodies, this primary response is often unable to prevent the person from becoming ill. If the person survives, exposure to the same antigen at a later date results in what we call a secondary response. This time, the disease is usually prevented, and it's usually prevented because antibody production is much more rapid, the concentration of antibodies produced reaches a higher level, and the higher concentration of antibodies is maintained for a longer time. This secondary response is made possible by the presence of what we call memory cells. Looking at the graph, when a person is infected by a disease-causing organism for the first instance, we call this the primary immune response, which you can see at the start of the graph. We can see that there is a bit of a latency period, so the initial exposure to the antigen leads to a very slow increase in antibody production. In that time, the person has often fallen ill. If they're exposed to the same antigen at a later point, we can see quite a considerable difference in the secondary immune response. This time, the disease is usually prevented, so the person won't become ill. The disease is usually prevented because, as we can see from the graph, the antibody production is much more rapid, the concentration of antibodies produced reaches a higher level, and the higher concentration of antibodies is maintained for a longer time. The secondary response is made possible by the presence of memory cells. These are B and T lymphocytes specific to the antigen and produced in response to the body's first exposure to it. When the body becomes exposed to the microorganism for the second time, the memory cells quickly proliferate and differentiate, producing clones of the T cells and the antibody-forming B cells. These lymphocytes can then destroy the invading pathogens before the individual shows the symptoms, and this is known as that secondary response. During the secondary response, we see that the disease is usually prevented because the antibody production is much more rapid, the concentration of antibodies produced reaches a higher level, and the higher concentration of antibodies is maintained for a longer time. An immunodeficiency disease results from the absence or failure of some component of the immune system which leaves the person susceptible to infection. HIV is one of these such infections. HIV, otherwise known as human immunodeficiency virus, attacks T lymphocytes. HIV attacks T lymphocytes. HIV becomes attached to specific receptors on the T cell's surface. The HIV particle can then fuse with the membrane of the T cell and the virus enters the cell. Viral DNA then becomes incorporated into the host cell DNA, where it can remain dormant for many years before directing synthesis of new viral particles inside the host cell. These new viral particles can then escape from the T cell by budding and move off to infect other cells. B lymphocytes do make antibodies in response to HIV, but they are ineffective against the viral particles that are hiding inside T cells. As the number of healthy, uninfected T cells gradually drops, the body's immunological activity decreases, leaving the person susceptible to serious opportunistic infections such as pneumonia and rare forms of cancer. It's at this point, when we start to see the drop in the T cell number, that the person can be diagnosed and said to be suffering from AIDS. HIV causes depletion of T lymphocytes, which leads to the development of AIDS. Individuals with AIDS have a weakened immune system and so are more vulnerable to opportunistic infections such as pneumonia and rare forms of cancer. Here we have an assessment standard question for the role of memory cells. You can take the opportunity to have a wee look through the question and we'll discuss the answers in a few moments. Describe how the poliovirus is able to attach to cell P. Well, cell P has membrane receptors that are specific to the poliovirus or the antigens on the virus. Cell Q should be identified as a P lymphocyte. And the role of memory cells in the immune system is that they quickly respond to another attack by the same virus or when being exposed to the same antigen. At the end of this PowerPoint, you're asked to reflect upon the two learning intentions that appear on the screen in front of you. If you're not sure of any of them, please go back to previous slides and familiarise yourself with the content. That's us at the end of the specific cellular defence. You'll find your summary to be completed on pages 32 and 33 of your student guide. Page 34, we have the summary of specific cellular defence. Remember, the summary is set to level C. On page 35, we have our retrieval practice flashcards, where you have to match the statement with the correct definition. On page 36, you have your retrieval practice mind map. And in class or via Teams, you have access to your targeted past paper questions.